Ukrainians know Russia better than anyone. Ukrainians know Russia's strengths and weaknesses. Ukrainians know what deters Russia and what doesn't. Ukrainians therefore know best how to secure peace. Today, I'm speaking to someone who wrote these words on their Twitter profile recently. I'm speaking to a rare breed of politician, one that not only understands the scale of threat to Europe that Russia represents, but is also not afraid of expressing these truths to power in a highly impactful way. Gabrielius Landsbergis is a Lithuanian politician and diplomat who served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania from December 2020 until November 2024. He's also a former member of the European Parliament 2014 to 16, where he served on the Committee on International Trade and the Subcommittee on Security and Defence. As Minister of Foreign Affairs, Landsbergis was a vocal advocate for European integration, NATO solidarity, and democratic values. His tenure was characterized by Lithuania's firm support for Ukraine during the ongoing Russian invasion, as well as efforts to counter Russian influence in the region. Thank you for joining us on Slick Curtain. To the audience, please make sure that you like this video because I'm sure you will appreciate this content, and check that you are subscribed. I would hate for you to miss out on any future speakers, any future videos that we publish on a daily basis. And as we approach the end of the year, thank you to everybody who has supported the channel, everybody who has bought me a coffee, become a patron, and especially those who've helped our Christmas campaign to buy trucks to send to the front lines in Ukraine, or who's helped our documentary film project, which we'll be kicking off in the early part of the new year. Gabrielius, welcome to the channel.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, it's a great honor, and it's quite thrilling as well because I recently saw you at Chatham House, and there were so many powerful things I heard there, which I was super keen to share with the audience. Let's start though with, I think, one of your most interesting statements recently, and that is that we must stop thinking of Ukraine's victory as unrealistic, because in doing so, you're quoted as saying that we let Putin define reality, our reality, and the reality for Ukraine if we do so. Why do you think this is the case? How does that process work? And how do we snap out of it?
Well, the question is, how did we get there? I think that probably there are points in history when the future is redefined, when we stumble upon something that is fundamentally new. Well, it can be repeated, but new in a sense as to these current times. And then it boils down to who defines the next steps. And it is clear that Putin is bent on defining the way that Europe should function or the West should function. We're so often remind ourselves and keep repeating that, look, he's, it's a declining country, just a gas station with nukes. And, it has been the main narrative from the West for a very long time. But now I have a sense that even though, I agree with almost all the sentiments that, yes, Russia's economy is 20 times less than the West and all the other things that I've said previously, but Putin has a way to define the way that the West works. And it can start in Ukraine. And we're giving into it. And this is truly, truly very worrying. When, you would see previous junctures in history, such as the end of Cold War, end of Second World War, and I could just go on with these things. It was usually the West that would define the way that world would function later on. And actually, out of this definition, my country, was able to reestablish itself in 1990s. Right, with with Reagan's support to captive nations, that Soviet Union has to fall, Star Wars program, and so many other things that now but it was the defining moments in history to define the history itself. So now we have to understand that it's not a regional conflict somewhere on the outskirts of the world, of the known world, but it's actually the way that Europe and the West will function for years to come if we don't wake up, if, as you say, if we don't snap out of this self-imposed weakness that we currently find ourselves in.
And there's another interesting phrase that's very associated with that, which the Polish foreign minister has recently said, and that is that the onus should be on Russia to negotiate, not Ukraine. But it seems that both in the media and indeed it seems some of the noises we get from many politicians, and I gather some of the conversations, in corridors of power, seems to be putting the onus more on Ukraine when, as the victim, they don't have an awful lot of control over what Russia does, except through the use of force and pushing them back. What are your thoughts? Again, is this part of the same process of misinterpreting Russia and trying to impose our own frameworks and understanding on a scenario that doesn't really fit at all?
Yeah, I mean, I've found myself in in these sort of situations when a couple of years back, Lithuania found itself under extremely heavy pressure by China due to our decision to allow Taiwan to open an office in Vilnius. At the beginning, the pressure was on us, and I had to fight my way in European corridors, trying to convince, very powerful friends, saying, "Look, it looks so easy, to break an arm of a representative from a country like mine, but your job is not that. You're so powerful that you can definitely, do something to try to convince the big powers, to reduce pressure on a country like mine." So it's clear, when those on whose support do we rely or have to rely, when they look at the whoa, they say, okay, this is the weak part, this is the path of least resistance, so we'll go there. Obviously, it's way more difficult to convince China, or in this case, Russia, to to back down, to actually start wanting the negotiations and stuff like that, rather than it's to push Ukraine. But there are two moments in this. So first one is the heroics of Ukrainians. I believe that if the West has been truly successful in pushing Ukraine to the desired path, well, we wouldn't have seen 3 years of resistance. You remember the main phrase of the war. I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. So something similar can be repeated now. I mean, clearly, there are those in the West who wish this to be over as soon as possible, and not thinking about the repercussions, the ones that we talked previously, and that's that. But then the second point is that, I mean, Minister Sikorsky is perfectly right by saying that it has to be Russia who should want negotiations, and all our policies, all our sanctions, assistance to Ukraine, support to Ukraine, has to actually achieve that goal. We have to. This is where our main effort has to be put in.
And I don't necessarily want to push you into saying anything negative about other officials, but there's an extraordinary statement on Twitter that just sort of really jumped out at me, made by Jake Sullivan, where he said it seems that you cannot pressure Russia on negotiations, at least you cannot apply pressure to force Russia to negotiate. Whereas in my mind, it seems the exact opposite. The more pressure you pile on the Russian economy, the more military pressure you pile on Russia, the more likely it is you are going to get some form of concession rather than meeting around a negotiation table and just getting a list of demands. Without impugning, anyone in the American administration, do you think that applying pressure and giving Ukraine, if possible, a better leverage within negotiations is the best that we can do at this point, rather than wishing for concessions from Russia, of which there seems to be no indicator?
Yeah, I mean, look, my point is that Russia will definitely not negotiate if it feels that it's stronger, and now it does. I mean, the best point to prove the best point in a 3-year war history, the 3 previous years, the best point to prove that Russia can be forced to to concessions, or at least to changing its mindset, was when Ukrainians were successfully pushing Russia out from Kiev, Kherson, and Kharkiv districts. And obviously, then came the nuclear blackmailing. But that was the crucial point. It showed that Russia can be actually pushed out. So with the promise to Ukrainians that, and what Ukrainians did then, that was very, well, the only right thing that they could do. That, look, we show that we're capable, we're able to do this, and we need your support so that we would be able to continue doing this. And if we would have promised support back then, I think that we would be in a different situation. Clearly, what is usually, asked, okay, so what do we do with nuclear blackmail? Well, that has to be a very different strategy that has to come on us, right? Where we have to devise the ways. How do we deal with that? Because if it works in Ukraine, that's nuclear blackmail. It can work then on any other country. So we have to figure out, right? So, a clear red lines involving, global partners, involving, other methods, let's say, so that, look, Ukrainians will be able to push you out. But if you start blackmailing us, then it's a different world altogether. You are basically dragging in the NATO directly into the conflict, and you don't want that. So, so with that in mind, it is clear that it is possible to push Russia, and we missed that opportunity then. I'm still hopeful, not entirely optimistic, but I'm still hopeful that this can happen again. Because the new administration that's coming in, when they speak about peace through strength, it gives me, this is where my hope is coming from. Because when I think about peace through strength, there's only one way to achieve it: is arming Ukraine, giving promises that that it won't stop in the near future, that Ukraine will be able to defend itself, and Russians will just bleed out in the long term or midterm.
And of course, the Reagan strategy, very similar there, and force the Soviet Union to try and keep up in an arms race, bankrupt
Exactly.
itself. We'll come to the economy in a minute, but it's fascinating, isn't it? Looking at Putin's desires, as you say, to deconstruct the Western world system and to take the initiative away from the West to present an alternative. I dare to not call it a vision, because I think it's a very nihilistic, poorly defined, but he does seem to have some conception of how he would like to see the world, and it is a world of anti-rules, anti-order, from what I can tell. But he's been saying or making these noises since 2007, like any Bond villain. He's been there telling us what he wants to do. And we've had, a number of my speakers, prominent sort of Ukrainians, would call themselves Ukrainian Cassandras, because they're the first one to sort of pronounce the worst case scenario and interpret, well, now Russia's going to do this. And it's met with disbelief. It's met with, shrugged off. Ukrainians are seen as emotional. You could also perhaps describe the experience of, I guess, the last 15, 20 years of the Baltics that way as well, trying to tell the world what Russia is and what it's going to do, and being ignored. Do you feel that that has now fundamentally changed, or are there still struggles?
No, definitely not changed. I mean, we find ourselves in a still rather similar situation. I think that the shock of the war, the beginning of war, gave some more prominence to Baltic politicians, so that there was acceptance, there was a bit more ear to what we're saying. But now, when we are saying, look, it's we're still on the precipice of a disaster. It definitely it is written. Putin has said, as you're saying, he's told what he's going to do next. And we see him already active, not just in Ukraine. We see him active politically in Georgia. We see him politically in Moldova, in European countries, such as in Romania, in the Baltic countries with this, shadow war activities. So it is clear. And then you have people, who take, a handbook of 1938 and just look at what Chamberlain said and believe that it can very well be repeated right now. And if you would listen now, I mean, what Baltics are saying, that if not stop, Putin will continue, that the next round will be more dangerous, more expensive, most likely it will check NATO, that that the countries around Russia who are not part of NATO are in very big danger, again, and without any major assistance, they might fall. And so this is the message from the Baltics. Honestly, what we would expect is to see some, well, measures, right, activity, strategy being formulated around this. Okay, so you've been saying all these things in the past; they've proven to be right. Now you're saying these things. So what should we do? Unfortunately, this is not happening.
I was about to produce an episode where I discussed the sort of what I thought was revolutionary bold move to force Europe into 3% GDP expenditure on arms. But I had to chuck that episode in the bin because Trump comes out with a target of 5%, although it is said that 3.5% is what he would settle for. Um, there isn't a single Western country, including the US, which currently spends 5% of their GDP. If the nuclear umbrella and indeed NATO umbrella is going to protect countries that only meet that sort of 3.5 to 5% criteria of GDP, this is a revolution, surely, which, I think the full impact of it wasn't really sort of elucidated or described in the articles that I've seen so far. This is a huge transformation of European society. And where money gets spent, budget, the number of people, the sheer volume of people that need to be drafted into militaries across Europe,
Mhm.
if we were to align with that Trump plan. What's your sense in politics of the sort of shock of this? Or again, are we snoozing through what seems to me a dramatic development, these noises coming out of the Trump camp?
I think we're still snoozing through even before Trump. I mean, there are still what, 9 countries that don't meet 2% of the GDP requirement at the time of greatest peril for NATO. Right, we're really discussing whether NATO can survive, whether NATO can be checked, all these other things, and then you have 9 countries who are not meeting the 2% criteria. So I clearly understand where President Trump is coming from. That is absolutely no surprise to me. I don't think that you would find a lot of surprised people in the eastern flank, beginning from, I don't know, Romania all the way to Scandinavian countries. Everybody say, yeah, I mean, this is what needs to happen. Right. So I've been talking about this for quite a while because um, the the culprit of the problem usually is being defined, by some Western politicians, is that, oh, look, for these sort of amounts of money, we need a new social contract. Just our voters just don't agree with these notions. My question would usually be, okay, so what did you do to make people agree? I mean, if you're hiding the reality from your population, where you say, "Oh, look, I mean, maybe it's not that bad," Yeah, there are those Balts, who are closest to the border, and they are, jumpy and nervous because of their history and proximity. But this is, just them. The reality is not as they define. Then clearly, it's very difficult to expect rewriting a social contract if you're not, truthful to your people. Right. For example, in my country, we had a very lengthy, very difficult debate that would, why would we need to go from, I don't know, 2.7, if I'm not mistaken, last year to 3.2%, basically adding 0.5% of our GDP to defense, which is quite a lot of money, especially when you have election year that we have. It's not easy. It's not helpful to your party, especially in my case. We lost the election, so it's difficult to advertise from a very short term political perspective. But if you're thinking about the dangers from the reality perspective or geopolitical perspective, this is what has to happen. So we have to approach a point where we would have to be honest with our populations that, look, we are in danger. This is the new reality, and I've used this example, that Great Britain has, before the Second World War, used to spend about 4% of its GDP to defense. Now, the height of Second World War, it was what, 50% of GDP. So that's a very telling number to your population, right? I mean, 4%, 5%, it's rather cheap compared to 50 if we're able to spend it at all.
And the costs of failure, well, we'll come to what would happen if Russia's victorious, because that's the sort of nightmare scenario.
Mm-hmm.
But even if it gets sort of limited goals and aspirations, and it seems that Putin believes he's still winning, he's talking about taking 4 oblasts in 2025. Whatever we might think of his state of mind or his state of delusion, he clearly seems to have a kind of confidence about him when you listen to his speeches, which is deeply, deeply unnerving. So it seems that that sort of physical aggression in Ukraine isn't going to stop. The other aspect that I wanted to ask about is you mentioned sort of NATO, and even in that Chatham House event, there seemed to be a diversity of opinion on, there's alignment on certain issues, and there's diversity of opinion on others. You'll have figures such as Edward Lucas and Keir Giles, who are on the more, to my mind, realistic wing, but some might see they're way out there, saying, look, NATO could be challenged. The very concept of NATO could cease to have any deterrence value. And indeed, Article 5 itself could be challenged in such a way using, as you say, Russia's salami slicing techniques,
Mm-hmm.
using grey zone techniques. A failure to respond to a series of sub-Article 5 or ambiguous Article 5 challenges could mean that essentially NATO protection is over. At that point, I mean, how cynical are you about that? And do you think it's too late for us to reinforce the deterrence value of NATO?
Well, my point in Lithuania was always that we are preparing ourselves for, what you could say, convenient scenarios where um, Russia has to amass enormous amounts of troops, take them all out from Ukraine, put them on NATO's border, give us enough time to prepare so that, that allies are being able to send the troops to reinforce. And this is the scenario that we are, kind of thinking that would develop, right? So that we see everything, we hear everything, we have ample time to prepare, and our forces are greater than our adversaries. This is the war that we are prepared. And I would always ask the question, why would we think that Russia would do such scenario, especially if they know that this is the scenario that we're preparing for? I mean, we've seen how fast did the Wagner troops, moved from Ukraine to closer to Moscow. It took hours, and now I'm really surprised that I've been reading Bob Woodward's War, and it is stated there that U.S. has known for a couple of weeks that Wagner will do a thing like that. It didn't look like that when it was happening. I've seen a lot of surprised politicians across the world. So, obviously the intelligence services in the US are very good in keeping their secrets, but at least, I mean, didn't look like, that this is a situation that is actually under control. The communication was erratic. We did not know what to say. NATO did not know what to say because the general just came out of nowhere. And then to add to that, how fast did they move from where they have stopped in Russia to Belarus? It was very close to the Lithuanian border. Just couple, basically we're talking kilometers from Lithuanian border. So imagine if Wagner can pull it off. Can Russians do something like that if they actually decide to challenge us? Of course, probably I would be, told that, look, this has to be a way bigger operation, but they're not betting on beating us on military field. They would be betting to beating us politically, so that we're slow, undetermined, divided, unprepared for unpredictable scenarios, and as you say, salami tactics. This is my main worry, that we are against another breed of adversary. This is not a this is not a Cold War type of war that we need to be prepared for. It has to be fast, very flexible defense. A lot of has to come from the countries within. The deterrence has to be where we are, so that the expectations of Russians have to be different. And at this stage, I don't have a sense that we are where we should be.
So it could be something like a lightning move down the Suwalki Gap,
Yeah,
severing multiple internet cables. It could be a whole series of
yeah,
unannounced events. And if there are no fatalities, then it's very easy for them to paint the response as being disproportionate.
yeah.
But
And look, Jonathan, I mean, to add to that, the nuclear blackmail. Imagine doing something, that is rather limited in its scope, and threatening with a nuclear strike if there is a retaliation for something that is very limited. So that all NATO capitals have to answer a question, are we ready to risk a nuclear war for, a severed, cable, destroyed, LNG terminal, a tiny city somewhere, the town in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, just by the border. Really? I mean, just so this is where I see the main dangers coming from.
some marshland in northern Finland, or
Yeah,
somewhere in the Baltic Sea, moving markers or buoys. They're
yeah,
already experimenting with this
yeah,
stuff.
exactly.
There's also the grey zone stuff, and we'll come to the coercive manipulation using nuclear because this is not new. Unfortunately, it seems to be very effective. But I don't know what your prediction for 2025 is, but it seems to me whether a sort of temporary peace is forced on Russia or not in Ukraine, that we are likely to see an uptick of grey zone aggression, such as the incendiary devices on DHL planes, even plots to assassinate, such as the CEO of German defense industry, and extraordinary things which would potentially be considered as declarations of war in other eras. In this one, we just try to bury it and pretend it's not happening. There seems to be the conception that if a peace in Ukraine is sought, you would have this moment like 1917, the guns fall silent, it's all over, fantastic, everyone's home for Christmas. This is very unlikely with Putin's regime, surely. In fact, we would see more cyber, informational, and grey zone aggression if his focus of his sort of toy soldier campaign in Ukraine is over. I use that phrase advisedly, not flippantly, because, of course, his speech recently was extraordinarily delusional. And he almost hinted that, or said that essentially he started the war because he was bored. I don't know whether that was something for sensational purposes, but extraordinary delusions of a tyrant there. But are you gearing up or expecting the aggression to escalate in 2025?
Yeah, I mean, it's the way that I calculate is, I see basically two main options. One of them is something of, Minsk 3 scenario, where Ukraine is left in a very similar situation as it was left with Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. Jokingly, one can call it Budapest 1, or Berlin 1, appeasement scenario, where certain territories would be offered to Russia. Then no security guarantees, no additional financial or military support to Ukraine, kind of leaving Ukraine in extremely vulnerable situation, and taking it upon ourselves as the West, so that we are guarantors of something of this sort of an agreement. So with this scenario, we've been there. I think that the truce, the ceasefire, the guns will be again not silent and loud very very soon after. If Because why Putin should stop if he also has a possibility of humiliating the West. He would put us in extremely difficult situation, because again, we would have to hide what is really happening, right? Because there would be a push from the populations, like, so what sort of a deal do you have if there's activity in Ukraine, shadow activity in the West? I mean, it would be a walk of shame for so many Western leaders, and Putin would just glamour in it. I'm sure. Now, if the other scenario would be if there is a promise of two things actually. One is a long-term military assistance to Ukraine that actually makes long-term difference in the battlefield, that forces Putin to overspend and overextend its already stressed economy. That is an incredibly enormous, important thing, and we should strive for that. And the second thing is security guarantees, so that he knows that the next day is no longer the same as it was the day before. If you shoot something at Ukraine, you're against the global powers. And that, and when I'm talking about security guarantees, actually, I'm talking about the placement of troops. So that it has to be real. It has to be very, very real. So if these two things happen, I have a sense that it changes or starts to change Putin's calculations. That he is in the long run. I don't think that he wants a long run. To challenge this establishment that is being formed, it's way too difficult. And then, probably then we would have some sort of a arrangement with Ukraine, Europe, NATO, and Russia.
And troops on the ground, I mean, there are already noises about putting trainers into Ukraine to make the training up of Ukrainian troops more efficient. But in the scenario you talked about there, with strong security guarantees on the ground rather than theoretical ones, this would also imply some kind of sort of closing of the skies, some kind of Iron Dome defense to cover the entirety of Ukraine's territory. I mean, that's not just a huge commitment, but that also would have potentially very great deterrence power. How likely and how actually well equipped are we to be able to close the skies over Ukraine in that manner?
Practically, I think that there is a great lack of equipment for such endeavor. But when I'm saying equipment, it's mostly stationary equipment launches. We would be able to do a lot with aircraft. With air policing and air defense, with our modern air fighter systems that we have. I think these things would be possible, and that again would be a very great deterrent, as you say. So, if we're talking, as a trainers as a first step, clearly it could work, because it allows us, to prepare our populations as well for this sort of activity, and it also allows us to bring in additional equipment into Ukraine. If you bring in trainers, you can bring air defense units to defend the trainers. They in effect defend not just trainers, but they in fact defend the cities that you're doing the training, and so on and so forth. So this is a push from our side that changes that dynamics. Now, when you ask about the whole political realism of the proposal, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to sound too pessimistic. I'm saying that practically, I think it's possible, but we do have to understand the cost of not doing it, because it's the only way. How do you measure it? Because if there are people who make the decisions, they do believe that we can get around this, that at this time around the appeasement will work, then clearly in their mind, doing anything like this that I'm suggesting is way more expensive. It's way cheaper just to make a phone call, go to Moscow, make an appeasement, and it should work because it's so cheap, right? And why didn't everybody just think of it from the day one? So this is why I see the biggest problem, that if we would be able to to transmit the message that, look, it won't work. The cost would be enormous in sacrifices, in money, in the lost credibility of the West. I mean, it's just horrible what can happen. And yes, then thinking about the things that I suggest is actually cheaper.
And where you have people like, unfortunately, Chancellor Scholz, who still think that you can get something by calling Putin, by begging him, entreating him to, behave in a civilized fashion, that just seems to give him greater impunity, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Um,
that's very unfortunate.
let's turn to the nuclear, because I think that the heart of this issue and the heart of why we, for instance, when Kuwait was invaded,
Mm-hmm.
made an immediate commitment and a huge deployment of military resource
Mm-hmm.
at incredible speed to take that territory back. In this instance, the concept of sovereign borders has not been vigorously pursued in the same way. And yet, we're talking about a country which is a democracy. We're talking about a country which shares more of our values than you
Mm-hmm.
could have said, Kuwait did. It's an extraordinary kind of contrast. What, in your view, is the role of this coercive manipulation using nuclear as a threat, and how effective has it been? Because there's two angles, aren't there? There's one is they threaten the actual use of nuclear. The other one is say, push us too far and Russia will collapse, and you'll have little kingdoms of warlords, each with their
Mm-hmm.
own nuclear weapons. So there's double-edged kind of nuclear blackmail going on.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's now we know quite well the inner workings, the way that it transpired. I mentioned, this turning event, the first successful counteroffensive, Ukrainian counteroffensive at the summer and autumn of 2022, when Russian leadership then clearly conveyed to the Americans that, look, uh, at the collapse of Russian front, the major defeat of Russian army is a nuclear type of event for them. Um, and it changed the way that we think about the war. It changed the way we think about Ukraine. It changed about we think about ourselves, and so many other things. I think that my feeling is that it has been as a scenario B for Putin. The scenario A was to decapitate the country, and scenario B was then, okay, if I'm unable, then I always have nuclear weapons. And Ukrainians clearly showed that they are prepared for scenario A. With our assistance, they were able to prove extremely effective, but we were not prepared for scenario B. And I'm not entirely sure whether we use the time to get better prepared, whether our doctrine has been amended to an aggressive country with nuclear blackmailing capabilities and abilities. And again, I think that out of this fact, the world has become more dangerous. And now, when we're hearing about the proliferation, for the last couple of years, it has been a great topic. From Indo-Pacific to Europe, you're hearing countries like like Poland, thinking about what would happen in the case maybe there is a way forward in this direction. Look, it wouldn't have happened if we would have a way how to deal with the blackmailers like Putin and Ukrainians themselves, right? I clearly understand where it's coming from. If we don't have a security guarantees, if we don't have military assistance, and we're left at the mercy of Putin, then maybe the only option for us to defend ourselves is to try to acquire nuclear arms.
And what must be very clear to people in the Baltics, especially with sort of individual family histories of the Soviet invasions, prison camps, etc., repression, torture, and of course many people would not have made it back, especially from the intelligentsia and so on, or leading politicians of that period in Baltic countries. As the Putin's invasion of Donbass has unfolded, and what we're seeing there now, which is a sort of gulag in plain sight, an area of absolute impunity and lawlessness. Um, Again, are you in the Baltics able to sort of see that and see the patterns in history in the way that Ukrainians will also, and have remembrance of the executed Renaissance, the Holodomor, and so on?
Mm,
Is the sheer toxicity of Russia's behavior in these territories, and indeed increasingly on its own territory,
mm.
is that well understood in the more Western European nations, or not yet?
No, I don't think so. Uh, Look, I mean, when when people had a chance to see Bucha, right, the territory that has been reconquered back by Ukrainians in the outskirts of Kiev. Um, I mean, how many decisions came out of that, right? We had sanctions, we had additional support to Ukraine, and so many other things because people needed to see the atrocities of Putin, with their own eyes, and that was very vivid, but very well useful, for the cause. And I used to ask, can you imagine how many butchers are there in the occupied territories happening every single day? Because there's vast territory and it's increasing every day, with new villages falling under Russian control. And I don't think we appreciate the fact what is actually happening there, because it very very fast becomes just statistics, right? We see how many square kilometers have been under Russian control, how many children have been stolen, and it's the shock is over, and then it becomes geography and then statistics. But it has to be told. It has to be vividly retold. I had a chance to visit one of the small towns, probably a village in Chernihiv district, closer to the border of Belarus. One of the villages that came under Russian control immediately after the war started, and it was held for a bit more than a month in Russian hands. So I met the people who about 140 people had to stay in the basement of a school, makeshift prison. In the tiny room, they were crammed together, and they spent there, those horrible days in a damp and cold environment. And then Lithuania was chairing a Council of Europe for the last half a year, and I've invited the representatives of that village to make a speech to address the ambassadors of the Council of Europe. And so many people were shocked. Even we are in the third year of war, and so many stories have been already heard. So many pictures have been seen, and President Zelensky is a terrific communicator. But still, these stories need to be told. They have to be given a voice because we just tend to forget that.
And the other thing I'm sure is appreciated the further east you go, and less the further west you go. We think of the Second World War and we think of the Nuremberg trials and there being some form of impunity
Mm,
holding to account for war crimes. But for all of the crimes of the Soviet Union, no one was ever held to account,
yeah.
whether in an international court of law or domestically. I mean, sure, they may have rubbed each other out during the Great Terror, but
Mhm.
no legal due process. Ukraine seems to be holding judicial processes, and this has not actually been mentioned in many of the articles that I read on this when the Russian generals were killed. I won't use the word assassinated because they're competent technically, despite the bad takes. They had gone through, in absentia, a process of law and been pronounced guilty. And it was after that judgment that they were taken out. There seemed to have been howls of outrage. But do you think these acts are not just sort of born out of the idea that strategically they could have some impact, but also that this is the only way in which Ukraine may get anything like a semblance of justice?
Well, from first perspective, it looks like just the way that the war from Ukrainian side is being fought, right? And they have a right to do that. They have a right to target those who plan, strategize, and inflict damage on their country. So it's in their right, and so that's war first and foremost. When it comes to justice, I believe that in one sense you're right. It could be explained to the people that look, those responsible, those making decisions, we keep an eye on them. There's they will never be safe. That is it. Whatever happens to us, but they will never be safe. That is a very strong promise, and I think that is, it gives strength to the people, because in our case, you rightfully mentioned that we have this sentiment that our justice was forgotten. That when and it's very clearly seen with, for example, when Gorbachev passed away, right? And he was praised, by so many in the West as a peace bringer, the one that got the Nobel Peace Prize and stuff like that. In Lithuania, he's remembered as basically as a murderer, because he was the one to send out the tanks in Lithuanian streets to take back the country, from its independence back to Soviet fold. And so there will never be, a street named by him. There will never be a monument or anything even close resembling that, because he's a criminal in our minds. The criminal that was never being tried, convicted, that never was being brought to justice. Now, on the contrary, it actually now is remembered as a hero, and it leaves a bad taste in one's mouth in here. So definitely, it's also one of the reasons why you would see Baltic states so strongly supporting Ukraine when it comes to their seek of justice. Lithuania was the first country to initiate the processes for the tribunal, and with our prosecutor's office, where we're making the calculating of the crimes and so many other things. So basically, there is also unsolved question in the Baltics that has a ring in Ukraine.
And this isn't so much a question, but I'm looking forward to someone actually writing the history of his later years when he failed to challenge Putin, when he must have known what was going on and the tendency in society, and yet did not speak out in a way that was strong and aligned with the values that we think he held. So we're approaching sort of the end, but there's a sort of last question. I think this is the fundamental one, and it draws together what we've talked about Europe and Western partners hitting snooze, not wanting to open that Pandora's box of how you deal with Russia because it involves so much responsibility, so many conversations with the electorate that are politicians, perhaps in their sort of disenfranchised state, don't feel they have the authority or strength or leadership to have those conversations. But there are two scenarios we need to contemplate, I think. One is the defeat of Russia and the potential collapse of Russia, and what happens then, and what our actions should be. And the inverse of that is a partial or even a full victory of Russia. It seems to me throughout the last 3 years, we have not tried to game this or, construct scenarios of this happens, how do we deal with it? Or even have any clear vision for the kind of Russia that we want to see when this is done.
My belief again comes from a history, from my country's history. I remember the time. I mostly read about it, but my close relatives participated in it. Was when Lithuania regained our independence. When we regained our independence, we have been asked to put a moratorium to our independence, because people were so afraid of what will happen if this actually becomes a new reality, new form of reality. And we basically didn't listen. We said, look, this is the only thing that we can do, right? Is fight for our independence, reclaim it back, and and this is what we have to do. Um, and it's very now because we won this round, right? We kept our independence, and Soviet Union collapsed. Russia did not collapse, um, and it all came out as a success. So this fact is not very often remembered, but I think it's bad to point this out, that if we would have listened to the voices of our Western friends, it's very likely that we would see Soviet Union in some form or the other, and you would see so many captive nations still under the boot of Moscow and Kremlin. So, and Ukrainians, again, they're finding themselves in a very similar situation where somebody would say, look, I mean, we're so worried about what will happen to Russia. So maybe it's best, kind of to look at the wider picture and not to your country's future, not to your own independence. Maybe just, put moratorium on Ukraine. That is the best thing that you probably can, the best gift for the West that can be delivered. And I would say, don't listen to those people. Just do the best that you can in order to defend your country, because that might be the only way to have your country.
This is more feeding the crocodile, isn't it? In the words of Churchill.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah,
uh,
until it feeds on you. Yeah.
and in terms of Russian victory, I mean, that is perhaps too terrible to contemplate. But lastly, do you have a conception that actually what we're missing here is that one of the largest and possibly most toxic imperial projects in history is in a process of a sort of slow Martian car crash of unraveling? So we may want to reimpose a status quo. We may want to, as it seems Western policy has been, to sort of almost protect Putin's regime from his own actions, from collapsing precipitously. But is this not an inevitable process that a sort of such a huge, inefficient, brutish entity such as Russia, which is out of kilter with the spirit of modernity, this cannot survive more than perhaps a few years or a few decades, and we have to somehow have a policy to deal with the unraveling of
Mm,
this vast imperial project.
absolutely. I think that it's past due time for us to have a strategy of how do you deal with a country that's actually unraveling, and the strategy cannot involve us giving in and allowing us to grab even more before it unravels completely. Right? We have to stand very firm, because it's about us, it's about our friends that are closest, and it's about our credibility, about our global credibility. Right? I mean, it is clear now that we're losing, big chunks of it, with the way that we're dealing with Russia. I would repeat the message of hope, that I'm hopeful that it's not too late for us to wake up now, with the damage that has already been inflicted on us all. And the most scary thought to me is that if we choose to snooze again, so what would force us to wake up? Is it attack on NATO? Is it Vilnius? Is it Warsaw? Or is it Berlin? My three questions.
That is what a place to end up. But I think yes, a very important thought experiment to conduct. Gabrielius, thank you so much for coming on the channel. It's a huge honor to be able to speak to you and to share your extremely clear moral clarity and political clarity with the audience.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Thank you.